Centipede.
Sup YouTube, Official Gaming Network, and welcome to episode 10 of our Jetpack Joyride game in Java tutorial. Last episode we created these super classes for our game. This episode we're going to make the handler class. And before I get into this episode, ever since I hit 200 subscribers, I've been wanting to do a Q&A. So, and I'll actually do the Q&A when I have enough questions asked. So, leave your question in the comments below and it will get featured in my Q&A. I actually created it last episode, and if you haven't created a handler class, then just go into your main package and quickly create a new class, call it handler. And as you can see, I haven't modified this class in any way. It's like what you would see if you just created a class. Now, a handler class pretty much handles all of our tiles and entities that are going to be existing within our game when we run it. So, every frame, a handler class will render all the entities and tiles onto the screen. And every tick or update, the handler will tick or update every entity and tile. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to write the code in the handler class, and it's going to render and update the tiles when the game renders and updates. So how we're going to render and update all of our entities and tiles? Well, we're going to put all of these entities into a list. Well, really, we're going to put all of our entities and tiles into a list. Well, entities and tiles will be in their own separate list. But anyway, what our handler class will do is that it will go through each of those lists one by one, and the entity or tile that it's up to in that list, it will get rendered. So let's say we created a render method. This is entity 1. Let's just call it E1, E2, E3, and then let's say there's a tile list as well, T1, T2, and T3. Now, what it will do is that our handler will go to E1 and render that, and then it will go to T1 and render that onto the screen, and then it will go one down into the list. So our handler will render E2, then T2, then it'll go one down, then render T3 and E3, and so on. And it does that for every entity and tile in the list, and it updates them as well, not just renders. So how we're going to store each entity and tile in a list is that we're going to create an object called a linked list. Now, the way we create this object is a little different from the way we usually have created objects before. So yeah, I'm just going to type it out and just follow on, and I'll explain what everything means. So we have to type public linked list, and in case you didn't know, linked list is the sort of list we're going to be storing our entities and tiles in. And then we're going to put these arrow things, so put 2 of them, and inside those little arrows we type entity, and we're going to call our linked list entity, and we're going to set it equal to a new linked list. Then we put the arrows, then entity again, then the brackets, then a semicolon, and we need to import entity and linked list. So we need to select the right entity, and there we go. So what we're doing is that we're creating a list called entity, but each linked list can only store one type of object, and what we put in these arrows is what type of object we want to store. So let's say if you want to store integers, then we have to type integer in those little arrow things. And yeah, we have to do the same thing. And by doing this, we created a linked list that will store ints. So int1, int2, int3, etc. And we can make our linked list store tiles, and and so on and so on. It can just keep going forever. We can store whatever object we want in a linked list. It's just that linked list can only store one type of object. Now we're going to actually create two linked lists. One will be for entities and one will be for tiles. So we're going to make a linked list tile. We're going to call it tile. Set it to a new linked list, and make sure in those arrows that you've put tile instead of entity. And of course, you need to import tile. Now I'm going to explain a linked list in detail. Well, let's use this entity linked list as an example. Think of it as a box. A box, like it has a certain amount of objects in it. Anytime we want, we can actually add and remove objects from that box. So let's make A, B, C, D, E. So yeah, anytime we want, we can actually add an object to that list or box. And anytime we want, we can remove it. And anytime we want, we can actually select a certain item in that box to like edit or do something else with. And the entity linked list will pretty much be made up of all the entities that exist, inside of our game, and that's the same with the tiles. So yeah, that's a brief explanation. Hopefully you understand that. And yeah, and now we're going to create two methods in our handler class. One will be a public void render method, and like what we did in our superclasses, as you can see here. We're going to specify our render method with a parameter because we already created a graphics.g object in our game class over here, so why go through the trouble of creating one again? Alright, and of course we also need to create a tick method, public void tick, and there we go. And now I'm going to create a for loop. As usual, I'll just type it out. You guys follow along, and then I'm going to explain it in full detail to you guys. So we've worked with while loops before, as you can see here. We made a while running loop and while delta loop, and now we're going to create a for loop. So type for, then in brackets, int I is equal to 0, then a semicolon. I is less than entity dot size, semicolon, I plus plus, and then we create our curly brackets. So what this is pretty much doing is that in this for loop it's creating an integer called I. So if we try to use I outside of this for loop, let's say if we set it equal to something, I is equal to 9, and then we get an error because I doesn't exist, but I exists inside of this for loop. So if we set I equal to 9 there, it works because this for loop, by typing into I is equal to 0, we have created an integer called I. And now by typing I is less than entity dot size, and then this for loop pretty much keeps going through the code as long as the value of I is less than the amount of entities inside of our entity linked list. So for while loops here, it pretty much keeps on executing all the code until the statement that we're checking for on the while loop is false. And this is kind of the same in the for loop, where the for loop will keep executing as code as long as I is less than entity.size, which is the amount of entities inside of our entity linked list. Now, what distinguishes a for loop from a while loop is this thing here, I plus plus. And what that pretty much does is that every time the for loop goes through all the code inside of it, and 1 will be added to I. So, let me just type in comments, we'll call it code. And, when we first create the for loop, I is equal to 0. So let's say the for loop executes the code once. Then once it's finished doing that, it will add 1 to I. And then it will execute the code again. And then it will add 1 to I. So right now I is 2. It'll execute the code again. It adds 1 to I is equal to 3. And it keeps doing that until, what we're checking here is false. So what this pretty much does is that it's making an integer called I is equal to 0. And for every time it executes all the code inside the loop, it adds 1 to I. And, the for loop will keep executing the code inside of it as long as I is less than entity.size. So, hopefully you guys followed along. That was pretty much the simplest way I could explain a for loop. Now we're going to make our entities render. So to do that, we type entity.get I.render G. Now what this is pretty much doing is that, let's just make an imaginary list of entities again. So let's say I was equal to 0, and then entity.getI will be the first entity in the entity linked list. Now you have to understand, because this is pretty important. I'm not sure if I explained this before, but Java starts counting at 0, and it doesn't start counting at 1 like a lot of us in the real world usually would. So if we're typing entity.getI and I is equal to 0, and then it'll go to the first entity in the entity linked list. So let's say if I was equal to 1, and then if we type entity.getI, then it would select the second entity in the entity linked list, and the same goes on. If I is equal to 2, it'll select the third entity. If I is equal to 3, it'll select the fourth entity, and so on. So yeah, I is equal to 0, entity.getI, it's selecting the first entity in the entity linked list, and then by typing .render G on the end, then we're calling that entity's render method. So if I is equal to 0, then it will render the first entity in the linked list. If I is equal to 1, then it'll render the second entity in the entity linked list, and so on. So that was like as simplified as I can get as well. And hopefully you guys understand that. And now we're going to create another for loop. We're going to make another integer called I again, because I only exist inside of this for loop, so whenever we're out of this for loop, I doesn't exist, so we can use I again and there won't be an error. But this time, in the for loop we're going to be checking if I is less than tile.size, then I++. Then we'll do the same thing just for the tile.getI.render G. And, we're going to do the same thing inside of our tick method. So just copy everything inside of the render method, paste it into here. We just have to change .render G into just .tick and without a G. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm going to wrap up this episode here. If you enjoyed, feel free to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. If someone you know is interested in learning how to program a game in Java, or is interested in watching game devlogs, please let them know about this channel. I would highly appreciate it. And if you have a Twitter account, please feel free to follow me on Twitter. So I'll see you guys soon. Bye.